Once again, thank you for joining us. This is our third meeting of the Harmonist Connection. I am Claire Eagle. I'm the Interim Assistant Director for Historic New Harmony. And I'm just gonna do a few housekeeping things before the presentation start. So the first is please keep yourself muted while the presentations are happening. If you have any questions or concerns, you can share those in the chat and I'll make sure they get to Brian, Sarah, and Mike at the end of the meeting and during the Q&A session. The second is that this is being recorded. So of course, if you have to leave for any reason or if you're having internet issues, it will be posted to the Harmonist Connection YouTube page within a week or so. It depends on how quickly we can get it together and uploaded. And finally, really thank you for joining us. Again, I'm the Interim Assistant Director for Historic New Harmony. We have Katina Kuntz from Harmony, Historic Harmony Inc. And then of course we have Sarah from Old Economy Village in Pennsylvania. And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to her.
Thanks, Claire. I'm going to talk a little bit about the burial practices, funeral practices of the Harmony Society. So I'm gonna start my video, share screen. Hold on a second. Okay. So the Harmony Society had burial customs that were a little different than what we're used to. Some of the practices came from Württemberg, Germany, where they originated. One of the things that they did was wrapping the bodies in a linen sheet. They would wrap it around and around, just like the Christ was. This is a picture that was done in the 19th century of Christ being put in his shroud. There's also the plain pine coffin. This coffin in this picture is not a Harmonist coffin. It's just one I found on the internet, but it shows how crude it was when they placed the body in the room. They would show people in their own houses for viewing just for a little while, and they would just be on something like these little sawhorses. So they were just a plain pine coffin painted black with no special handles, no anything, no embellishment of any kind, just very plain. And flowers were also a really big part of the whole funeral custom. They really liked flowers, and they would put flowers all around the people's body, in the coffin and around the coffin. And then when they would bury the person, the coffin would be lowered into the ground and the flowers would be all put on top of the coffin. So everyone, whenever someone would die, they would go to the gardens and just collect all the flowers. And that's part of the reason why they had geraniums on their windowsills. Here is on the right, the coffin. This is a Harmonist coffin at the Working Man's Institute in New Harmony, Indiana. And then this is the hearse at Old Economy Village, which was new to them in the 1880s. So before this time, they would just put the body on a wagon in the coffin and then take it down to the cemetery. So for the procession to the cemetery, they would usually just choose 6 people to go and take the body down to the cemetery. And it was just chosen, like the first 6 would be allowed. That didn't always go over so well. And usually women could not attend the funeral of a man. And the funeral procession itself was men behind the coffin for a man's burial, women behind a woman's hearse or wagon for a woman's burial, and a children behind the children's wagon if it was a child's death. So the last person to use this hearse was Franz Gilman. He died in 1921. So this picture is the last time that it was used. And he died in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, at the Duss family home in 1921. And then he was brought up to Pennsylvania with John Duss. So the cemetery was often known as a Friedhof, a Gottesacre or God's Acre, a court of peace. There's different ways of calling the cemetery. So this is the Harmony Cemetery in historic Harmony. And the wall was not originally built around that cemetery. The Harmonists went and had that built around the cemetery later. And there's about 90 people, at least 90 on Find a Grave are listed for this cemetery. And you can see, oops, sorry. You can see the old picture on the bottom left. That is the inscriptions above the door. And now it's pretty well worn that you can't see it as well. But all of these things that are in the picture are what the translation is. It's all in German. So here rest 100 members of the Harmony Society who died from 1805 to 1815, and then many biblical verses all over that arch. And then this is a very amazing door. It's solid stone and it's attached to the archway with a pin, and it still works. All you have to do is push it, and you can push it with one finger. It's amazing.
Oh.
So it's nice if you have a chance to go try that out in Harmony. And then there's only one grave marker for any harmonist, and that is for Johann Rapp, Johannes. That was George Rapp's son, who died in 1812. And this was placed in the cemetery a long time after he died. And it's all in German, and you can see the English translation of that. So the stone has also been moved. So we're not sure where John Rapp was buried, but it was broken and then put against the wall to support it. And then in the New Harmony Cemetery, it's all surrounded by a big brick wall. So it seems like a really big area for the amount of people that are in that cemetery. And there's around 230 people. That's from Find a Grave. And then outside of the gates, there's the Presbyterian Cemetery, non-harmonist people. And then inside that right picture, you can see their Indian mounds in their cemetery. There's no grave markers in a harmonist cemetery. You can see from that. This is the cruciform church, which people from the Harmony Society went to, I don't remember if it's the people took it down or they had it taken down, but these are the bricks that form the wall around the cemetery in New Harmony. And this is the cruciform church that George Rapp had a vision of building, and it was built pretty late in their time in New Harmony. And then the Economy Cemetery was in the orchard of the Harmony Society, in the South Orchard, south of the village. There's 602 people in this cemetery on Find a Grave. The historic marker says there's 594. That's the thing with the cemetery with no markers. You don't know exactly how many people are in there, but these two are stones that are in the cemetery that you can see. Rebecca Ott and her daughter Estella Delaney, and then Louise Rohr. So there's other people. These are hired workers buried in there. And in 1934, people were allowed to put a marker on their loved ones' graves to mark hired workers. The first burial in this cemetery was William Lamox in 1825. He got sick during building economy, and they said, you know, we better find a place to bury people. So they put it in the orchard. Here you can see a view from across the river, and the cemetery is that white picket fence in the orchard. And then not far south of there, also in the orchard, was the Indian mound at Economy. And this is a picture of the Indian mound. They would go and visit this, you know, just going on walks, but once a year at least, they would have Decoration Day. And that was usually in May. And all of the harmonists would go out for a walk. This was chosen by the trustee at the time, you know, what day they would go. And then they would go take all the flowers they could find and then go down to the cemetery, visit with the dead in the cemetery, sprinkle flowers all over the cemetery so that it was almost covered, and then walk down to the Indian mound and pay their respects there. So it's always said that there is a list or a map of all the people buried in the cemetery, and I have never seen a map of that. And the book on the left is the closest I have seen to anything that looks like a map, and it's actually not a map. This is it looks kind of like grave markers. They're kind of like really hard, almost like a cardstock piece, and they're threaded through the threads. And if you look really closely at the book, in between these blue markers, those are pretty much families of people that died. Although that doesn't look like it from this picture, but this is the closest I can find. And on the right, you can see we have several books that have all of the people from the Harmony Society listed in them. And this one happens to be the one where Lawrence Thurman, the first curator at Old Economy Village, he wrote in the book that John Duss was buried in 1951. John Duss's grave is an interesting story. He was buried, the last person in the cemetery buried. This is his grave when it was open. And when they were down there for his burial, they were looking around saying, oh, I wonder where Susie Duss was buried. And Lawrence Thurman said, oh my goodness. And he ran down Church Street back to his office at Old Economy Village and took the urn that was on his desk, that was Susie's ashes, brought it back to the cemetery. They opened the coffin, put it at the base of his feet, and said, there, they'll have to be together for eternity now. And that was some story. So so they're together in the cemetery. But the undertaker for that didn't know where anyone was buried, and he had to go around and feel with a stick to find out where to bury him. And so he's kind of buried a little crooked in the cemetery. It's not perpendicular to the fence. And he was buried in a metal coffin. So it's a little different than almost every other harmonist. But this was one of his first burials, and I met him when he was getting ready to retire. So that was really interesting, but he's now deceased. Some other interesting things about the cemetery at Economy was the Indian mound was leveled when Ambridge became a town, and whatever remains they found were buried in the Economy Cemetery in Ambridge. And then there might be people buried outside of our fence. Our fence that we have now is not the original fence. As you can see here in 1951, it's a chain link fence. So there might be burials outside the fence. And then there was also a body found at the library, which is just to the right of this picture. And so that body was buried in there. No one really knew who that was. And I don't think I want to steal Dr. Hanks' thunder, so I'm going to end it there and pass this over to Mike, Dr. Strezewski.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Can you see that? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
I'm seeing a nodding there, so looks right. Okay. So as you can see, I'll be talking about the Harmonist Cemetery in New Harmony, specifically, where I did a fair amount of archaeological field work a few years ago, concentrating not only a little bit on the Harmonists themselves, but also on the Indian mounds that Sarah had mentioned. So here's what the cemetery looks like today. And as Sarah was talking about, there's no grave markers there. It's just an open mowed area. And you can see a few lumps there in the picture. Those are some of the Indian mounds that I'll be talking about. The Harmonist Cemetery in New Harmony is located at the northwest corner of town, kind of outlined right here by the brick wall. Here's the Wabash River over here. Here's the Athenaeum, the visitor center for the town. And there's that square just kind of outlines the brick wall itself. So it occupies a fair amount of space. Who's buried in there? We don't have exact number, but according to Arndt, well, the number that's quoted in some of the documents, I counted every person there, and there was 217 individuals apparently buried in this cemetery. The other thing that's in the cemetery, as Sarah had mentioned, was that there's some Native American mounds. Not much was known about these mounds. This is one of the reasons why we were working in the general area. We wanted to answer some questions about who built them and when and all that sort of thing. There's possibly as many as 12 at one time, which we'll get to in a moment, but currently not that many can be observed for a very long time. And apparently during the time when the Harmonists were there, this cemetery was an orchard area. So the people were being buried in what was the orchard, and it at some point in time remained an orchard for some decades. This is a map from 1835 to 1843, somewhere around that time period, shows it being an orchard on the west side of town there. And at some point in time also, it was surrounded by a wooden fence that was kept up after the Harmonists left. The Harmonists had contracted with Robert Owen and some of the Owen community who purchased the town after the Harmonists left, and they wanted to make sure that the cemetery was kept up, and they contracted with him to keep it up and to erect a wooden fence around the area. So the very first, with reference to the mounds, the first mention we have of these mounds is by Charles Alexander Lesueur, who was a French naturalist and artist who was part of the Owen community. And somewhere around 1826 or so, Lesueur made a map of the mounds in the cemetery. It's a pretty decent map for its time, but you can see this is probably this square right here is probably showing the extent of the wooden fence that once surrounded the cemetery. It doesn't correspond 100% to the wall that's there today, but you can see clusters of mounds inside the cemetery. There's a cluster of 5 mounds right here. There's a few more mounds inside of the cemetery here, one at the very corner, it would appear. And then the other thing that's of interest is the fact that there were a number of mounds outside of the cemetery. You can see one over here in the northwest corner, another one to the north, and other ones dotted in various spots as you even getting farther south in New Harmony, this is a sketch of where the old church was, the brick church. And there was a couple mounds to the west of that, and a large mound and another one even farther to the south. Lesueur did some excavations in some of these mounds. It was probably one of the first, if not the first, archaeological work that's ever done in the state of Indiana. But he dug in the mounds numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down here, and 6. And when he reports finding is mostly pieces of pottery, some animal bones, some stone tools. Occasionally, he said he did encounter some human remains, but not a whole lot of human bones were found. And I don't know if that had something to do with the poor preservation conditions or something like that. But in general, you know, his descriptions were not super specific, especially since he didn't know what he was looking at. So we didn't really have a great handle on who built these mounds and when they may have been constructed. Here's a map that I made, kind of superimposing the mounds that were once there on top of a current aerial photo. And you can see quite a few of them inside the limits of the cemetery as it is today. But the rest of these have all been obliterated over the last 200 years. This one over here, right near the Fauntleroy house, that one was probably the last one outside of the cemetery to kind of still be around. It was extant in the later part of the 19th century, and then it too was removed when this house was built on the corner right here. Some of these other ones, actually, some of the reports indicate that the Harmonists actually dug into this one over here. There's no report of what they found, but some people noted that they were digging in that mound. Here's some of the things that Lesueur reports finding. You can see it says here, grave of New Harmony right here. This artifact right here, we can now identify. He didn't know what he was looking at because he didn't know anything about, you know, the prehistory of the whole area. But that artifact we can now identify as probably being a discoidal, also known as a chunky stone, which would have been a gaming stone that was used by Native American peoples. This artifact right here is probably it's thought to be sort of a ceremonial or a shamanic item that was used during the early late woodland period. That artifact probably dates to about maybe 100 BC or so, possibly. And then he has provided a drawing of some pipes that he found, whether they were in with the mounds or in the general area, we're not 100% sure, but I can't really tell you how old those are. They don't really have any distinguishing characteristics that would say that's from a particular time period, one or the other. So that's, you know, we don't really know a heck of a lot about what was found in the course of his investigations, other than just real general descriptions. So as Sarah was mentioning, the cemetery today is surrounded by a brick wall, which was constructed in 1874. When the Harmonist church, the brick church, the second church in New Harmony, was ready to be demolished. It was in fairly sorry condition, and they were going to tear it down. And Jonathan Lentz, one of the trustees of the society at the time, came to New Harmony, and they bought the plot where the church was so that they could salvage the bricks. They took all the bricks the whole ones that they could salvage from the demolition of the structure or a large portion of the structure at least, and they used it to build this wall. They didn't have enough bricks to build the entire wall out of Harmonist brick or church bricks, so they had to purchase some additional bricks, but at least a portion of that wall is built out of bricks from the church. And it was redone and refurbished in the 70s. There was a major project to fix the wall because it was in pretty sorry shape. Okay, so kind of getting on to the archaeology part of it. This is a map of LiDAR data. Essentially what we're talking about is satellite data showing micro changes in elevation. What I wanted to do was kind of generate a map of the mounds and their location within the cemetery. And this is very fine-grained data, but you can very clearly see in this LiDAR data, here's the cluster of 5 mounds that Lesueur mapped back in 1826. Those are still there and still visible. And then we've got 3 other mounds, one here, and one right here, that are also visible in the LiDAR data. The other ones that Lesueur mapped in, no sign of them, at least in terms of anything above ground at this time. And I don't know, if it was just a figment of his imagination or if there was something actually real there that's been, eroded down into so it's not visible anymore. Another thing that we picked up with the LiDAR data was this kind of funny shaped thing surrounding or kind of going around the perimeter of the cemetery. So I was wondering what the heck this could be. It had never been reported before or anything like that. I thought perhaps there could be some type of a prehistoric or Native American earthwork that was surrounding the mounds in some way. And I thought, well, that might be kind of exciting. So here just kind of shows what I'm talking about here. The mounds themselves and this sort of surrounding low berm, I guess you'd call it, around the mounds or inside the perimeter of the cemetery. It's really hard to see. Now, you can see this student here standing on the top of it, and then there's another student standing in kind of the ditch area of it. That's the most visible part of it. In other spots, it's almost impossible to see even when it's closely mown. So like I said, at first I thought it might be something related to Native American mound construction, some type of an earthwork surrounding the mounds, but now I'm convinced that it probably is not. This is a map, or not a map, sorry, a photo of the cemetery from 1938. And at that time, and I don't know how long this went on, but at that time, you could actually drive into the cemetery and drive around the cemetery to look to tour around it in your car. Well, you can't do that anymore, but I guess in the 1930s, they thought that was okay. So I think probably what they had done was kind of piled up the earth in order to create a bit of a roadway so that you could drive around the perimeter. You can kind of see a little bit of the roadway in the background right here, but I think that's probably what that is, and it has nothing to do with the Native American occupation of the area. So unfortunately, I was kind of excited for about 3-4 days. So we did some investigations inside of the cemetery to see if we could spot, graves or anything like that. And we used 2 instruments. The first one is a magnetometer, and the magnetometer is an instrument that detects magnetic anomalies beneath the soil. So a lot of people always ask me the question, how do you know where to dig? How do you know where things are beneath the surface? That kind of thing. This is one of the instruments. They're pretty commonly used these days in archaeology to find things beneath the surface and kind of scope out where it might be a good place to excavate. So we weren't interested in excavating inside the mound, but we did want to see if we could find any inside the cemetery, that is. But we did want to see if we could locate anything of interest inside there. So here's one of the students collecting the data. Now, this instrument, like I said, detects magnetic anomalies beneath the surface. It's pretty good at finding things like iron, burned things, certain types of soil disturbances, that kind of thing. And then we also did another survey using a resistivity meter. And this works on a little bit different principle. What it's looking at is it injects electrical current into the ground. So you take this device right here, you poke it into the ground, there's some spikes at the bottom of it, and then it injects electrical current in the ground, and it measures how well or the electrical current can pass through the soil. And so it's good at detecting things like soil disturbances, so like you might get with the excavation of a grave or something like that. So we thought, with a couple of different instruments, we might be able to see something interesting there. So we collected all this data in the entire cemetery, the entire interior of the cemetery. Here's the results of what we found. Now, this is the magnetometry data. So one of the things you can see is here's the 5 mounds right here, that cluster of 5 mounds. Magnetometry is good at picking up accumulations of topsoil. So I think this probably what you're looking at is like piling up topsoil to create the mound. And so you're able to see it that way for that reason. The other 3 mounds that are a little less visible, here's one of them. There's another one over here. And then the other one, this one is virtually invisible. You can also see kind of coming around around the perimeter of the cemetery, that's that roadway Then there's a lot of other stuff going on here. Around this edges here, you can see a lot of black, white, black, white. That's the interference from the brick wall. So bricks can set off the magnetometer. This cluster over here, I think somebody was dumping garbage over the wall or something like that. But in terms of like, you know, Harmonist graves, which everybody was kind of like, oh, well, are you going to be able to identify where all the people were buried? The answer is, you know, we really couldn't see any clear Harmonist graves there, with one exception. This area right here, it's a little fuzzy right here, but here, I'll kind of flip back here and you can see what I'm talking about. But what you can see here are look like some rectangles going from this spot to here. So for those of you who are familiar with the cemetery, the entrance to the cemetery is right over here. This is you know, the gate that Sarah showed in her presentation. So this row of graves kind of proceeds in this direction. How many graves are we talking about? Somewhere around 40, perhaps. I tried to get a decent count based upon the signal that we were getting there, and I'm guessing maybe around 40 graves. But what we're looking at are people that are buried right next to one another in one single row. And oddly enough, are buried north-south, which is an odd orientation for Christian burials, but I'm fairly sure that's what these are. I think they are, in fact, burials. Here's the resistivity data. So a little bit different looking, but you can still see that path of that driving path that goes around the perimeter of the cemetery here. We got some really weird anomalies in there. I don't know what the heck they are. They're like this thing right here, this squiggly line. I'm not sure what to make of that. But what's interesting in this data is that you can also see that row of graves in the data. Flip back and forth. In fact, it's a little bit clearer in the resistivity data. You can actually see some rectangles like right here and right here. So that row of graves is showing up with two different instruments. So I'm fairly certain that it's real, right? So in order to say a little bit more about the cemetery, and I was especially interested in looking at the Native American occupation because we really didn't know a heck of a lot about it. There was really not much information about what culture or cultures may have built these mounds. So what we did is we put in some excavation units in areas surrounding the cemetery. We put in a bunch on the eastern edge over here, some up towards this direction over here, quite a few all around the northwest corner of the cemetery, and then even a few down here on a little bit to the west, right near where the bridge is, just to test out that area as well. Here's just a couple of photos of those excavations in progress. So essentially what they were, most of them at least, were some small test units to sort of dip your toe in the water and see what's out there. So those are some of the smaller 1 by 1 meter units that we put in. Here's a photo of a bit larger area that we opened up on the northwest corner of outside the northwest corner of the cemetery to get a little bit better idea of what was out there. All right, so one of the things, the questions that we were able to answer with a fair amount of certainty is as to who built the mounds. We found quite a few artifacts. These are some pieces of pottery that we found in the course of those investigations that are related to a culture that archaeologists call Crab Orchard. I wasn't able to get any carbon-14 dates from this particular occupation, but based upon the decorative motifs and the traits of the pottery and the artifacts that we found, I'm going to guess it was probably somewhere around AD 100, so approximately 2,000 years ago. Here's some other artifacts related to that occupation. These are called Snyder points right here. There's some blades from the Crab Orchard culture. So that was one occupation. Another occupation that we found was about 400, 500 years later, from a culture that we call the Allison culture. And here's some pottery fragments that we recovered around the cemetery from them. This occupation I was able to get a carbon date from, so this one's a little bit more secure, and it was dated to about 350, 400 AD. Here's some other artifacts related to that Allison occupation, a couple of spear points here, and some narrow blades that are related to that later what's called the Middle Woodland period, right? So the strange thing, the weird thing about this is this Allison occupation really doesn't belong there. This is a map showing where Allison, what's a culture is called Allison Lamott. These things are usually found farther to the north, up around Vincennes, Terre Haute area. And this thing is really out of place. This Allison occupation here in New Harmony really doesn't belong there. So I don't have really time to get into all the explanations of why that might be the case, but it's a bit out of place this far south in New Harmony. The interesting thing about this is when we did the excavation, we did not find any Allison or crab orchard structures. We didn't find any cooking facilities, any, storage pits for storing food or anything like that. We found a lot of artifacts, but nothing that would suggest houses or, long-term occupation of that immediate area. And what I think was going on here was this might have been a spot where people are coming, they're staying for a short period of time for some type of ceremonies, maybe related to the burial of important individuals or something like that. And then they would leave after they had buried those individuals in these mounds and then go back to their regular village, wherever that happened to be. So I think that all this material that we are finding surrounding the cemetery is related to sort of temporary occupations by these folks. And I am almost virtually certain, even though we didn't excavate in the mounds, that these are the folks who built the mounds. Some of them may have been built by the crab orchard people and then later added onto by the Allison people or something like that. I don't have any definite information on which mound was built by which group or anything like that, but I have a pretty good suspicion that these are the folks that built the mounds in the New Harmony Cemetery. So they're about 1,500, 2,000 years old, more or less, right? I'll show you the last thing that we wound up finding. The third occupation that we wound up finding was actually concentrated down here to the west of the cemetery. And that is a Mississippian culture occupation. It's pretty much contemporaneous with Angel Mounds, if you're from Evansville, and you may know that site. There's a completely different type of pottery. There's small arrow points that we recovered from that area right there. This one I was able to get a carbon date from about AD 1225. So it's about the same time period as Angel Mounds. When we did some little test excavations over there, we found a lot of burned material, charcoal, burned, a thick layer of burned material, and we identified a number of post holes, which I think is the corner of a house. So this looks like a house that had burned down, and we were able to get some charcoal from that and got a carbon date, like I said, of about AD 1225. So this is a little bit different of an occupation. Like I said, the Allison folks and the crab orchard folks were there on a temporary basis, I believe, and related to mound building. The Mississippian occupation, I think, is more of some folks are actually living there. There's houses in this area, might have been a small village or something like that, or a farmstead, perhaps you might call it. And then there were some Mississippian burials out in this area over here. This mound up in the corner over here, the one that I said that the Harmonists had dug into, we can recognize based upon the descriptions that those were almost certainly Mississippian period burials. So folks living over here and burying some dead people in a mound over in this direction right over here, right? So it's a little bit different. So that's really what I have to say about the Harmonist Cemetery in New Harmony. Unfortunately, can't say a huge amount about the Harmonists themselves and where they're located, but we can say actually quite a bit more about the Native Americans who were working in that area and building mounds in the area and inside the cemetery. So we answered some questions that have been kind of longstanding questions for some time. So that's all I have, and I will go ahead and stop share and then pass the torch over to the next speaker here.
Thank you, Mike. Can you see the presentation there? Okay, excellent. All right, so I'm presenting tonight also on behalf of my colleague at the University of Pittsburgh, Mark Berman. And so some of the results I'll be talking about tonight come from exploratory surveys that we've been doing with University of Pittsburgh students. So we've been very, very grateful to the Penn Historical and Museum Commission and Sarah and Michael for letting us come out with students And it's an interesting project in that, you know, it sort of followed along with the evolution of our geophysics program at Pitt. So we sort of started out using one instrument, which didn't produce very good results. And then we started purchasing more instruments. And Sarah was always kind enough to sort of let us come out and do some exploratory surveys and sort of get up to speed with the equipment as well. We also worked quite closely with Dennis Lapik, who's a resident in Ambridge. He was the first person to reach out to me to see if we might be interested in doing some work at the Old Economy Village. And so we're very grateful for that contact as well. So in general, we're trying to help with the identification of burial pit features. And as Sarah discussed at the beginning of her presentation for the Ambridge site, there are very few markers or headstones at the site, and most of those were placed sort of after the burial of workers who had been involved with the village there. And so we were quite unsure about the orientation of the burials, the sort of the types of coffins, or if coffins were even being used. So we really didn't know what to expect when we first started out. So the first communication with Sarah, when we did a walk around of the cemetery site, there's a marker there that she mentioned in her talk that notes that there's 594 members and workers buried within the cemetery. But Find a Grave has, you know, a few more, a little over 600 there. The fenced in area that you can see quite clearly on this Google Earth image, that's about 2,700 square meters. And as Sarah mentioned, a burial had been found during some of the foundation excavations associated with the library here. And so one of the questions was whether there may be burials that would exist sort of outside the perimeter of the fence, for example, in this sort of green area here along the street. And we first started, you know, primarily within the enclosed area where, you know, there are a few headstones and we can be relatively certain that there are definitely Harmonists and workers buried there, in hopes that we would be able to understand the sort of data that our instruments were collecting and sort of learn how to interpret and how to read that data, sort of looking for specific patterning that might relate to grave pits that would be placed in a row. As Sarah mentioned, you know, there was no real map available of the cemetery itself. There's some historical documents that both Michael and Sarah passed on to us over the couple of years that we were coming out and doing a day or two survey here and there. And so these, as Sarah mentioned, you know, we'll record names, but it's very difficult to know whether this really is a kind of spatial organization plan of where these individuals were buried or not. Some other notes that come from historical sources, there was a sort of excavation, I think, along the fence area at one point, and there were some graves that were encountered, and so there were some notes made there. These notes are interesting. I mean, it shows here the fence along the east side. There's the gate. This is the south side of the cemetery, the west side of the cemetery. And so I sort of took this as a preliminary thought that the graves might actually be oriented in a north-south direction. It makes a difference for us when we're doing a survey with the instruments, as we would like to sort of bisect or go perpendicular to the long axis of the burials if possible, because it can produce more data for us to interpret. Again, you know, with various methods like ground penetrating radar and magnetometry and earth resistance and so on, you know, it really does matter whether or not there's grave furniture associated with the burials, such as coffins or coffins that might have had metal fastenings or other parts, because those can, even with the deterioration of the wood, you can still get kind of a collapsed grave pit where there will be more of a kind of loose fill or hollow space. And then of course those metal implements might still survive and be there. And so instruments like radiometry, as Mike mentioned, those can actually pick up iron quite easily. So these notes here noted, you know, poor preservation of remains, but there were also children noted here as being buried and encountered during those excavations, but there was very little information available on the actual depth of the burials. Sarah discussed the last burial that was placed within the cemetery of Dr. John Duss, who was the last trustee of the Old Economy Society. And we were really uncertain as to where that burial might be located. Because it was a 1951 burial, there was the thought that he might have been buried in a contemporary style coffin, and that may respond better to the types of instruments that we were using. In 2019, Michael Knecht found this pamphlet, and it had a picture of the actual grave site as it was excavated in the winter. He passed on December 15th. And so Sarah passed this on to me, and it corresponded based on the building across the street and sort of approximate area within the cemetery, which is in the north. This correlated very well with a very strong reading that we had from our instruments a year or a year and a half before the photo was passed on to us. So I'll point that out as I work my way through the data. Most of our surveys, as I said, have been sort of exploratory in nature. It can be very, very difficult to detect historical burials in cemeteries like this if there are not headstones there, if the coffins did not use metal fastenings, if individuals were wrapped in shrouds, as Sarah explained, and placed without coffins, and then the soil that was excavated to produce the grave pit, if that's kind of put back in and compacted over the body. Over time, the body, of course, will degenerate and break down, but it can often be very difficult to tell, right? There's not much remnant there to really indicate through the instrumentation we use that there was in fact a burial there. The other important thing is that this cemetery is situated very near the Ohio River. And so most of the soils within present-day Ambridge are a kind of silty clay. And so clay, depending on the amount of soil moisture and salinity, can also be very difficult when using things like ground penetrating radar because of how it sort of diffuses the electromagnetic pulse. So in other words, these cemeteries can be extremely challenging for archaeological geophysical techniques. And we've found that through the work that we've done. But I'll do an overview tonight of the 4 methods that we've employed. A couple of them are producing much better data and are showing real promise for continued work there. I'll just sort of wrap up with kind of, where we stand with results to date, and then the potential that we see for future research in completing a full survey of the cemetery with the methods that seem to be working the best. So we used, as sort of Mike discussed for the surveys that they did in the other Harmonist Cemetery, we use sort of a grid system. This probably looks a bit like Greek to you, but this is just noting the different methods that were employed within each of these grid squares and their number, block number. And so this is representing gradiometry, resistivity, and GPR. We have not been able to complete a full GPR survey of the cemetery, and GPR is proving to be probably one of the most promising. And another method I'll mention tonight is electromagnetic conductivity and magnetic susceptibility, which also is producing very good data. We did do an exploratory survey with only GPR in this area right outside of the fence, and we did have some anomalies that were responding to the GPR signals. And so I can't say definitively that we found evidence of burials here beyond the perimeter of the fence, but there's enough data to indicate that much more work should be done there in the future. This just indicating, again, our survey zones with other instrumentation. So the first instrument we used is exactly the same instrument that Mike discussed. It's the Bardington dual probe flux gate radiometer, which basically is a passive instrument that just measures variation in the Earth's magnetic field as you pass over various types of anomaly. With grave pits, quite often it can be metal fastenings associated with coffins or headstones, but it also can respond to the nature of the grave field, particularly after the decomposition of coffins and or the bodies themselves. It can enrich the soil in a way that through bioturbation that can increase the magnetization of that soil. And so in some cemeteries, again, depending on the contrast between the grave pits and the soil fill within them and the surrounding kind of sterile soil, gradiometry has proven to be pretty effective in some historical cemeteries, but I'll show you the results in a moment. So this is our full gradiometer survey that we did inside the perimeter of the fence. The instrument was affected very strongly by the fence itself because there are nails for the pickets of the fence. And so the black and white and the streaking that you see all along the outside relates primarily to the interference from the fence lines. You can see, however, here, this very strong and quite large black and white dipole anomaly right here. And that, in fact, is Duss's grave site. We can be pretty sure of that, I think, based on the results of the other methods as well. There's some enhancement that we've done. We've worked pretty hard to try different steps of processing and filtering this data. You know, with, I think, somewhat limited results in terms of actually being able to say that we see clear evidence of patterned grave pits. But the cemetery, in a sense, is very busy. There's clearly been a lot of different kinds of activity within that space over time. One of the most interesting other features, besides the one I noted here that's Duss's gravesite, is this sort of black circular anomaly that you see here with kind of the white in the middle of it. And it shows up a little bit better in the lower left here. That appears to be a very large pit feature with possibly some small metal plate or spike or something right in the middle of it. And there is a very large deciduous tree. You see these kind of green streaks right here. That's the dummy data that we input when we move around the trees, because we can't survey through them. We have to survey around them. But it's just to the north side of a very, very large deciduous tree. And most of the methods that we've used, that has shown up. There are also some small pit features here that seem maybe associated with that. There's also some dipoles up in this area here. Those probably are metal related. You can see them in the unprocessed data up here. We also, very much like Mike described to us with their resistance data, the electrical resistance data, we also had an interesting curvilinear feature up here, which you can see in the raw data and then all through the different processing steps here. And it's difficult to interpret. You know, normally with magnetometry data, when you see both black positive and white negative responses, I mean, this can be something related to metal or some kind of a ditch feature or berm feature of some kind. I'm not really sure, but it could even relate to the orchard use prior to it becoming a cemetery by the Harmonists. The sort of final plot, finished plot, if you will, that's overlaid within the cemetery shows these very clearly. This large white fuzzy object that you see there was the sign that I showed in one of the beginning slides, noting the number of Harmonists and workers that were buried in the site. And so that interfered with our instrument. Since we did the survey, Sarah, I think that's been moved outside of the cemetery. This you know, large pit-like feature again shows up in the curvilinear. There are a number of positive and negative anomalies that appear down in this area here. This is where there are several headstones that were placed, I guess, after 1935 for the workers. And so these may or may not relate to perhaps the workers might have been buried in a different way, maybe with coffins that might have had some metal fastenings, but it's very interesting that this sort of southwestern zone is much more active. So the gradiometry has been largely affected because of the metal in the fence and also other metal objects associated with the cemetery itself. But certainly this very large anomaly, which we investigated further with other instruments, it jumped right out as Duss's grave site. We also used an earth resistance instrument. Michael described that in his talk. Not to repeat what he discussed, but just very quickly, there's a twin probe array here, and then there's a remote set of probes over here, and it basically measures the resistance to the electrical current moving through the ground. We used a very simple 2-probe array, which gets down to maybe about 1 meter in depth. We have other arrays that have up to 5 probes that we can do multi-depth profiling. And I was hopeful that this method might actually work quite well, especially if the sampling density was much tighter. We might be able to pick up that contrast between the soil surrounding grave pits and the grave pits themselves. But the resistance data that we collected has been hugely affected by the topography of the cemetery, where there are some sort of rises and sort of dips as well. And these dips hold a lot of moisture. Because these are clay soils, that moisture will hold, for a very long time, associated with the roots of the grass and so on. And so in processing this sort of data, I mean, we're getting, there are some interesting responses again down in this area. Some of these negative responses would correlate to Mike's presentation potentially, which he showed as potential rectangular grave pits, but they don't seem very patterned, and the data is just not very reliable based on the nature of the soil moisture. So earth resistance, I think, is probably, the potential is pretty low for future work. It's certainly worth trying, possibly in a period of time when we haven't received much rain in the Pittsburgh area and things have dried out a bit, but there's still enough moisture to carry that current. But we might try the multi-probe array and just try to do some profiling to see if we can improve what we're seeing there. But mostly what you're seeing here is just simply areas of the cemetery where there's less water, where there's higher resistance in ohms, and areas where there's less resistance, where the water has sort of settled down in that area. And so that's just the sort of final, this sort of darker area right here, where there's higher resistance, that is directly associated with where Duss's grave site is located. And so, yeah, that's just another instrument that we've used is a GF Industries CMD Mini Explorer. It's basically a probe that has coils separated along this probe. We have a nice pair of minion socks on the probe just to protect it from the moisture that day and the debris on the ground. But this actually is a 2-method instrument where we can collect electromagnetic conductivity, which can show that variation in the soils, particularly grave pit infill to the surrounding soil. And it also measures the susceptibility of soils to being magnetized. What makes this instrument particularly good is that it does so simultaneously, but it also, you can collect up to 6 different depth measurements. So the probe has to be turned to do 3 and turned back to do another 3, but it can do up to 25 centimeters, 50, 80, 100, 150, and 180 centimeters in depth. So very much within the sort of range that we would expect with say grave pits down to say around 6 feet, between 4 and 6 feet. So we've had quite good responses in areas of the cemetery with this. That does seem to be showing some patterning of anomalies in kind of a linear fashion, as one might expect for and sort of ordered grave organization. So we did CMD in these 2 areas in the northern part of the cemetery. This shows some of the data here. I'll go through it in a little bit more detail, but this right here, the red, sort of large red anomaly you see, that is Duss's grave site. The kind of blue that you see here, there is a stand of trees right along there. And so this is very much relating to the root structure of those trees, but we are getting very patterned responses, as you can see here, in kind of a linear organization as we sort of move through other parts of the cemetery. And that's what we're particularly interested in pursuing and collecting data probably in a more intensive fashion, but then correlating with the GPR, ground penetrating radar data, that I'll show you in a moment. This is basically showing you the different receiver coils on this instrument. So this is actually overlaid in the right fashion. So if you can imagine it being kind of turned counterclockwise, this is actually pointing here to the north. But this is just showing some of the sort of patterned responses that we would hope to see with conductivity. This is Duss's grave pit site right here. It really shows up. And so this is at 50 centimeters. The middle one is at 1 meter, and the third one is at 1.8 meters. So again, showing some real promise there. This is showing the in-phase magnetic susceptibility, which is the other method that this instrument does. This is showing Duss's grave pit here, and again, some of these patterned responses. So magnetic susceptibility at the depths of 50 centimeters, 1 meter, and 1.8 meter seem to be providing the best data that we have so far for possible patterned grave pit rows, if you will. So this is just the last overlay of that, showing it at 1 meter depth. The GPR unit was an exploratory unit down here. I'll show that right at the end of the presentation, but I'll move through and talk a little bit about ground penetrating radar, which is the method that probably most people have heard of or are familiar with. I think many people think that if you have one of these, you're going to find grave pits without a problem, but it doesn't work like that. It takes quite a bit of work, depending on the soil characteristics and the nature of the burials themselves. This particular GPR is made in Canada by Noggin. It uses a 500 megahertz antenna. It's a single antenna instrument. This is the type of antenna that's typically used in forensics, so criminal investigations, but also in archaeology. It certainly goes below 3 meters in depth, but it is very, very good at that kind of range of from surface to about 3 meters. The nice thing about it is that you do get a display, an immediate realization of the data. I mean, it's not filtered or finely processed, but if you're pushing it over things, you can see the data distributed on the display here, the LED. It's helpful in sort of exploratory surveys initially, but following up with more systematic ones. So I'm going to go through GPR Unit 1 right here and GPR Unit 2 here, and then I'll jump down and show you the exploratory Unit 4 down here. So these are some anomalies that popped up. I could talk for about 5 hours tonight on GPR data if you'd like, but I don't think you all want to hang around for that. But we did have, again, some very good patterned responses in that Unit 1 that correspond to the instrument, the CMD that I was talking about, producing quite good data. Some of these responses are quite strong, and you can see some patterning associated with these. So this is the sort of plan view, the bird's eye view looking down. This shows what does appear to be a strong reflection, probably from the bottom of the grave pit or near there. If we look at this image on the lower part of the screen, this is actually the profile view. So the GPR cart would be on the surface here, starting at 0.0, and you'd be pushing it along the grid. So this red line that you see in the plan view starts here and moves across. And so this is showing the surface level and then actually moving down in depth down to, on the left here, that's 3 meters. And so I've basically just identified these two strong responses here and shown you that we see disturbance here in the surface sort of layers, and deep further down this is showing this anomaly here. There's a pretty strong reflection right here, which I think might be near the grave pit bottom, and then we have a very strong, it looks like a rectangular set of reflections coming probably from the bottom here as well, and this is this anomaly here. So the thing about GPR data is that you collect data along transect lines, parallel lines, and quite often you have to return and resurvey, narrowing those lines, because grave pits, again, you can think of a kind of I guess 3 feet by 6 feet and about 6 feet in depth. But as over time, as these burials sort of disintegrate and so on, if there isn't a coffin that's keeping that kind of structure in place once the body disintegrates, at best you're probably going to get sort of oval reflections around the kind of center of that, generally the bottom of the grave pit cut. depending on whether there's a coffin, or sometimes if the body is still preserved to some degree, you might get some reflections from that, but not always. So it can be very challenging. This is showing Unit 2, and this is actually Duss's grave pit here. You see an extremely strong response. In the plan view here, you see the red line going through it. That's the transect line being shown down here. And you can see the disturbance. This would be the grass level here, and then moving down to about 50 centimeters here. You can see that there's the different stratigraphic layers of the soil as they kind of go in, and then it's very disrupted all through this area here with a number of reflections coming from the bottom and the sort of parabola here as the GPR is approaching. You get kind of this upside down U shape here as the GPR signal, the cone of the signal, is beginning to encounter this anomaly that's reflecting the waves. And as you move over it, it gives you that kind of distribution of the data. So I feel very confident, especially given the photo that Sarah showed in her talk and what I showed, that looks exactly in the right location for this very, very strong anomaly that we picked up. And this is the same anomaly, but at a depth of 145 to 150 meters. So down just about two meters, or around 6 foot in depth. We're still getting reflections right down near the bottom of that as well. I'm just going to talk very quickly. Yeah, this shows where we set up over that the Duss's grave pit site, and I've outlined it right here. And you can actually see a depression in the surface if you walk over that area today. And so the GPR picks this anomaly up really, really beautifully there. So we went back and did this kind of a smaller survey, collecting more data per transect, and you can really see the anomaly here at 145 to 150 meters in depth. So this is GPR Unit 4 down here. As I said, we had a number of quite strong responses. There are a number of these parabola here that are showing up. We're getting reflections down at 1 to about 1.8 to 1.6 meters here and here. This at a little bit different depth, you can see there are a number of anomalies that are appearing here. These are reflections from the GPR signals, and again down to about 130 to 135 meters. So I can't say anything definitive because we did a very quick exploratory survey of that area, but it certainly merits more detailed work, especially using some of the other instruments like the CMD Mini Explorer and resurveying it with GPR. But there may in fact be burials there that are just outside of the southern perimeter of the cemetery fence. So that all looks interesting and quite promising. So we have had the great opportunity to be working there with our students, and we're hoping that we can return this spring term, given that COVID restrictions are beginning to relax more and more, fingers crossed. But we would really like to return and do a complete, very systematic GPR and CMD survey of the cemetery. We would use a total station for basically pinpointing spatially all of the features that are within the cemetery, including the headstones that are visible on the surface, and then providing that to Sarah and Michael. We plan to make all of our data open access, and that will be available to Sarah to distribute as she wishes, as it would be, I think, a good database for future scholars. And certainly that kind of thing, open access, invites other scholars to look at the data, the raw data, and potentially process it to maybe find other things as well. There's a real art form to not only collecting geophysical data, but processing it as well. But over the surveys that we've been doing, we've been learning more and more about how the instruments respond. And I do think we're making good progress with what we're finding, and hopefully we can continue to build a better picture and possibly even a spatial understanding of the burials at the site. So thanks to Sarah and Michael just for the opportunity to be working there. Students really appreciate it. And Mark and I would also like to thank all the students that have been involved in coming out and helping us there as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike and Brian, for those wonderful presentations. I will open the floor for questions. So if you do have any questions, please do share them in the chat. And Brian, I did have a question. Did you look into the Native American mound near the cemetery at all?
No, I know that Sarah and I talked about that. I'm not sure where it's located. I think it was south of the cemetery, but I don't know if that's in open land or if that's been built over. I'm not aware.
I think it's on Kennedy Drive, right around where there's a huge church that was built right where I think the cemetery or where the Indian mound was. But I don't know, maybe it went underneath the street. So that's a possibility of finding anything.
Well, I'll give it another minute just to see if there are any questions or comments. But thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. As I mentioned, this is our third Harmonist Connection meeting, and we will have more in the future, and we're exploring a variety of topics. Oh, we did have another question. So I believe Mike and both Brian mentioned that the Harmonist graves were north-south. Is there any significance to this in regards to their beliefs or anything like that?
I can just say none that I'm aware of. I don't, if that's the case, I really don't know why. And I looked into it and, you know,
I saw your comment next. I just read it.
Yeah. So I just wanted to double check with Brian. You mentioned that you thought maybe they were, but I didn't know the orientation of all the images that you showed there. So you do think that the Harmonist graves there are oriented north-south?
Well, I think we were going on, some of the historical information that had been found. Some of the graves had been opened during some repair work there. And they seem to indicate, I mean, they were very clear in marking the orientation of the plan with the fences and the gate and so on. It seemed to be that they were in a north-south orientation. Duss's grave certainly was dug in that fashion. Based on the data that we have, especially the GPR data, that does seem to be a north-south orientation as near as I can tell. But we most of the anomalies that I described with the CMD and the GPR, the responses do seem to be elongated in a north-south fashion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting considering how unusual it is.
Yeah.
And Sarah, who would prepare the bodies for burial within the Harmonist Society? Was that someone's specific job?
I have not found someone that was an undertaker. I think, without knowing exactly the answer to that, I think it was probably prepared by whoever the family was because they were laid out in their own homes. So I really don't know.
Well, I feel like considering the descriptions we have of other jobs and things like that, I feel like if it was someone, we would probably have that information. So I lean towards your theory as well, Sarah, that it was the family that would prep.
Yeah, I would think so. And there was one person that kept the books about who died, and so there was something in the newspaper clippings from the 1890s that said that person who keeps the books would be able to point out where everyone was buried, but the people that were related to him probably wouldn't know. They would there were depressions in the ground, and they would just count how many depressions until they knew where that person was buried. And I didn't mention this, but the graves were supposedly just one right after another, about 3 feet deep. And they would probably put a stick or something right at the end of the last one, but they could see the mound. So, or the depression. So they'd probably know where to bury the next person. but there were no markers. Although that one picture of the cemetery from across the river, we can't get too detailed on that because it's a faraway picture, but there's marks on the fence. So I don't know if that's a plant of some sort or what, but there were some sort of marks. Also in the research, I saw where Jacob Henrici was buried by the gate. I'm not sure where the gate was at that time, though. We know where they are now. And then another thing that I found just yesterday was there was another person in a metal coffin. And that was, I think, Herman Fisher. He died in, I think, around in the mid 1890. And the reason why he was in a metal coffin was because he died in Pittsburgh and was shipped back by like a funeral director there. How long were they viewed before burial? Sorry, this was just to me. It wasn't very long. I don't know how long that was. I would think a day or two. And like I said, they were buried, or sorry, they were laid out in their homes. But Jacob Henrici was so well loved by the community, by people all over the place. His funeral was so well attended that he was laid out in the Great Hall, which I think was the feast hall. And so people could go by and pay their last respects there. And then he was brought to the church for a service. And his was the only one that was in English and German, so that it could be interpreted by, it could be understood by anyone in the congregation there. And then Gertrude Rapp was the first one probably buried in her regular clothes, not in a shroud. And if you know about the story of Henrici and Gertrude, Henrici couldn't even speak during her whole viewing, and he couldn't give the last prayers and everything because he was just so distraught by her death. George Rapp's funeral. I know that his coffin was $8. That's all I really know about George Rapp's. He was unmarked like everyone else, and he just felt that people should remember them in their hearts and in their memories. And he was not any different than any of the other people.
I thought it was kind of fitting, knowing John Duss's personality and what we've heard about his ego, that he was the only one whose grave can be picked out, with any certainty in the Economy Cemetery. I think he probably would have wanted it that way, perhaps.
And it's interesting that it's not marked.
It isn't. Yeah. I see somebody asked about Native American mounds and not finding evidence of houses in those cultures, and whether or not the river had changed course or location in the past 1,000 years and could have affected where the settlements were or once were in existence. I mean, yeah, that's a possibility. I don't have an exact idea of the precise location of the Wabash River channel at that time, 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. Sites do, get washed into the river as the channel migrates. I honestly don't know where those folks were residing. I assumed it was somewhere nearby, but we haven't identified the archaeological site where they may have been living, and they came to that spot to bury their dead. It was probably close by, but I don't know for sure. Yeah, and I don't think anybody's mapped out the changes in the channel that would kind of say precisely where that was at the time.
I know they really scarred the land whenever the river moves. But also Kentucky was a hunting ground, right? And is that close enough to Kentucky that maybe that was just for, going and doing something and then going back home?
Yeah, I mean, during the historic period, Kentucky, yeah, was more of a hunting ground, as was southern Indiana. But when we're talking about, a couple thousand years ago, there was a large resident population in southwest Indiana. It was only after about 1650 or so that there was no really permanent resident population in the area. So, we know from Angel Mounds and some of these other sites, big archaeological sites in this area. In fact, southwest Indiana has the best archaeological sites in the state, that there was a lot of people living in this area over thousands of years. So I don't doubt it was probably somewhere close by. So.
All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it, and I hope that you'll be on the lookout for our next Harmonist Connection. Thank you to Historic Harmony, as well as Old Economy Village, as well as Bryan and Mike for participating. I always learn new stuff at these presentations, and I'm sure Sarah does too. You can work at these sites for years and years and years, and you're still learning. So I always have the best time with these, and I hope you do as well. So thank you. I hope you have a great night, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.